Welcome, everyone. Today's live thought leader webinar is titled Contract Management and Governance, Building the Plane as You Fly It, and is brought to you today by NTRAX. The live webinar will last 60 minutes, and there will be an opportunity for Q&A. To submit your questions, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window. Now I will turn the presentation over to our first speaker, Ritu.
Thanks, Kristen, and thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Ritu Cooper, and I am a shareholder at Hall Render, Killian Heath, and Lyman. I'm a co-office managing partner of our DC office, and I co-lead our compliance service line. My area of focus is mainly fraud and abuse, so I work with various types of healthcare providers with their compliance programs, also providing guidance on STARK, kickback, the CMP laws, and then work with a number of entities who are under corporate integrity agreements. Melissa, can I toss it over to you?
Sure. My name is Melissa Roop. I am legal counsel at Integris Health. My practice is focused on providing strategic counsel and advice, mostly on payer strategy issues, joint venture formation, contracting processes, and then corporate governance. I've successfully implemented a system-wide improvement of the contracting process, resulting in enhanced efficiencies, cost savings, and risk mitigation. Before this current role, I served as in-house corporate counsel for a commercial company where I provided legal guidance on healthcare compliance issues, third-party agreements, and any regulatory requirements. And then I also have experience as an associate attorney at a regional law firm where I counseled hospitals and healthcare industry clients on a broad range of healthcare issues. Stephanie, I'll kick it over to you.
Thanks, Melissa, and thank you, Ritu. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stephanie Haywood. I'm the Senior Vice President of Sales and Client Engagement with NTRAX. Over the past 20 years, I have worked with healthcare organizations across the country, implementing and advising on best practices as it relates to healthcare contract lifecycle management, facilitating the design and development and implementation, really focusing on the best unique aspects of each individual healthcare organization. Not everyone is alike, and I've seen everybody from small standalone rural critical access facilities all the way up to some of the largest national health systems in the organization in the country. I work really strategically to help support successful implementation by providing advisory expertise and participating in roundtables or leading consulting engagements aimed at really helping organizations improve their contract lifecycle management processes, their governance processes, mitigating compliance and financial risk, and driving efficiencies and enhancing operations. And I'm really thrilled to be speaking with Melissa and Ritu today.
Awesome. Well, Melissa and Stephanie, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your expertise. It has been a pleasure working with you to prepare for today. Just a little bit of background. I think most people are aware that Hall Render and NTRAX have a little bit of a history. NTRAX was started initially by Hall Render back in the 1980s, and we've remained connected in various ways over the years. So as you can see with our agenda, we have a very packed agenda. If you have questions, as Kristen mentioned at the beginning, please feel free to use the chat feature or the question and answer feature, and we'll manage those as we go. But what we thought would be really helpful is to have you guys give us a little information of who we have out in the audience. So we'll turn to a couple of polling questions. So our first question is, what is your role within your organization? So are you in-house, in the legal department? Are you in the compliance space? Are you with a private law firm? Are you a consultant, a vendor, or other if none of the above fit for you? Hopefully everyone has put their answers in, and whenever Kristen is available to put it up, we'll see. So let's see. So we have 55% are from the legal department, about 10% from compliance, 14%. Okay, well, that's good. If you are one of those that marked other, feel free to in the chat let us know what that other might be so we know, but welcome to all of you. Okay, so our question number 2. How confident are you that your organization's contract management processes support your compliance goals? So are you very confident that you have strong alignment between legal, compliance, and operations? Somewhat confident, but there are gaps and inconsistencies. Not very confident, we're still figuring it out. Not confident at all, it's a major area of concern. Or I'm still new to this area and learning. I promise when you answer this question, it's confidential. We are not going to track anyone who might say that they're not confident, just to get a sense of who we have in the audience. All right, so if you guys can answer that, and then shortly Kristen will pop up our results. Okay, so we have about 9% that are very confident. The vast majority is somewhat confident, so that's great. About 20% not very confident, and 5 and 9. Okay. For those of you who are new to the role, again, in the chat, feel free to kind of share where your role might have been before coming into this contract management space. Okay, let's go to our next question. Which best describes your organization's use of outside counsel for compliance-related contract work? Do you rarely or never engage outside counsel? Do you use outside counsel kind of reactively, only when issues arise? Do you engage counsel proactively on very high risk or high value contracts? Or do you work closely with outside counsel as an extension of your in-house team? And then, of course, if you're not in-house, the not sure NA would be fine to mark. Okay, so we got a good mixed bag there. Some of you rarely use outside counsel. Some of you have it as an extension. That's great. And then, of course, we've got the about 25% where it doesn't apply. Okay, now for our last question. How does your organization currently manage your contracts? Are you in the Stone Ages? You handle everything manually on paper and in file folders, no judgment. Do you use some basic digital tools like spreadsheets or share drives where you manage your contracts? You're semi-automated. You have a system and you somewhat have workflows, but you still rely on your manual process. And the last one is you've got a robust CLM solution that's fully implemented, automated, streamlines all of your contracts and your life cycle management process. Okay, great. So it seems like the vast majority of you have some kind of automation, or you've got some digital stuff. We've got very few, again, no judgment for our Stone Age folks. I'm a paper person myself, so I get it. And then some of you have a robust program, which is amazing. So again, we definitely want this to be an interactive session. So for those of you who do have a robust system, please feel free to share any of your thoughts in the chat for the good of the group. So thanks, Kristen, for putting up those polling questions. All right, so with that, Melissa, I would love to start with you. Do you mind telling us what prompted Integris to begin the process of defining a governance structure and a contracting process?
Absolutely, Ritu. I'd be happy to. So there were a few primary reasons we initiated this work. First, our leaders really recognized a need for a standardized approach to contracting. So I know we have a lot of in-house counsel present on this webinar, so I don't know if y'all have had this experience, but for us, different departments across our health system each had their own unique methods for how they would receive a contract for review, engage legal services, negotiate that agreement, process it for signatures, and then maintain the executed version. And this lack of standardization across the system was creating inefficiencies and inconsistencies. And then second, I would say our legal team has long understood the need for a much more thorough business and financial review of contracts. So previously, our leaders would identify a perceived contract need. They would bring it to legal services, and then we would perform our legal or regulatory review. While we were focused on ensuring the terms were appropriate, we couldn't assess whether the price of a certain item was fair or if we had another vendor maybe performing a similar service elsewhere in the organization. So our review is limited to the legal aspects. And then sometimes we had contracts that were approved simply because they were championed by someone who had enough authority to push them through. So the question was, who is performing a rigorous review to determine, is this actually a good idea? Not just, does it have acceptable terms? So our legal team had been advocating for this governance for years. We just lacked the infrastructure to know who should be providing input and through what means beyond just legal.
I think probably a lot of people in our audience can relate to that. So can you help us just understand the initial steps that Integris took to establish the governance structure for this contracting process? I think we've probably talked anecdotally with the number of people where you just kind of paralyzed to start. So it'd be great to know your steps.
Yeah, absolutely. So the opportunity first arose, we had this big contract accountability initiative. So we were aiming to encourage our leaders to really take continuous ownership of their contracts, even after execution, right? So this meant asking our leaders to understand the key terms of their agreements, their vendor selection process, how did they choose that vendor for what reasons, termination provisions, that type of thing. And this push for individual ownership, it actually caused our leaders to question, like, why are we even in this contract? So they started to question the necessity of certain agreements we had entered into. And that really highlighted the need for more accountability just from the start. So from there, we started assembling leaders from key departments that were already involved in the contracting process and began meeting as a committee on a regular basis. Now, this process started just before I joined Integris. So my first week at Integris, I attended one of the very early days contract governance committee meetings. And it was clear to me that while a framework did exist, there were significant opportunities to enhance the structure and the efficiency of this process. So I was really eager to contribute to streamlining and operationalizing this governance process to better support our organization. So for me to get started, I met with our deputy general counsel in a conference room with a massive whiteboard. Like you're saying how you're a paper person, I'm a visual person. So we mapped out our current process, like what is currently occurring. And we identified what are the pain points, like time lags or any unclear accountability. And this exercise provided us with really good clarity, and it formed the basis for which we were going to propose improvements to the process. So to give an example, when we mapped this out, this highlighted that there was a really significant time lag from when legal services received a contract for review and we were submitting that to the committee, and then when the committee would actually meet. So that exercise prompted us to have a conversation and identify what is an appropriate time frame. That way we can try to prevent these contracts from snowballing, because we all know how that can happen. So from there, I started drafting our foundational governance documents. So things like a charter for the group, sample meeting minutes, what kind of information do we need to include? So that way we could start to formalize the roles, the responsibilities, and the expectations for the group. I really prioritized on a personal level just attending every single committee meeting so I could listen, like what are the recurring questions? What concerns does the group consistently have? And that would signal to me a need for refinement. So this ongoing feedback loop, it allowed us to continuously evolve the process to ensure it remained responsive, efficient, and still aligned with our organization's goals. So this allowed us to identify information that we needed to capture on the front end, and then we would update our request for contract approval form or our intake form accordingly.
Okay, I definitely want to talk to you about these foundational governance documents, but before I get to that, can you share with us who were the primary stakeholders who were involved in the creation of this whole governance structure?
So initially it was small. So the primary stakeholders that were in it from the very beginning, they were pretty much just from legal, supply chain, and IT. But we really quickly realized significant gaps, and we identified leaders from other business areas that we wanted to be able to provide input. So, for example, it was a big surprise to us, but finance wasn't initially involved. They didn't really have insight into the contracting process. So initially, right off the bat, we saw an opportunity for a more robust financial review early on. And then as we continued to meet, we expanded the membership of this committee just whenever we saw a need, pretty much. So this was often a result practically just from consistently asking a certain business leader to attend a particular meeting so that they could provide input when we had a question on an aspect of a contract. And then after we're asking the same individual or same department repeatedly to come to our meetings, we realized we could benefit from their participation on a much more consistent basis. So to give an example, we quickly recognized the value of having an operational or a clinical leader participate on our committee, right? These were folks that had visibility into all the different hospitals in our system. And so they were actually able to help us identify duplicative services. That way we could create more of an aligned strategic approach just across the entire system. So today, as it stands, like I said, it's always changing. Our committee includes leaders from 9 areas, and we have a quorum to vote on contracts as long as 5 of those 9 disciplines are present. So the key stakeholders include finance, revenue cycle, legal services, supply chain, IT or IT security, operations or clinical, support services, HR, and then marketing or foundation, which is our fundraising nonprofit arm.
Okay. Well, it's very interesting to see how your group grew because that's so similar to what the OIG's expectation is. It for compliance, right? For compliance committee, the OIG always talks about how there should be a cross section of the organization. So I found that very intriguing that your contract management, right, group also has that cross section. So I guess the OIG got it right, that you want stakeholders from all over involved with certain processes. So can you, I mean, now that you have this very diverse group, right, from all over the organization, can you share with us some ways that you ensured maybe alignment or cooperation amongst the group?
Sure. So it helps. We received immense support for this project from our CEO and our CFO. So these 2 individuals view the time and energy involved in developing and sustaining this process as a true investment in the future state of our organization. And I really think without that directive from the highest level, it would have been challenging for us to get sufficient buy-in from our business leaders. We also have provided in-depth education numerous times on how this process works. And we wanted to be able to clearly articulate to our vice presidents and our leaders that owning their own contracts is now a core function of their jobs. They have to be involved in the process. So with this education and top-down direction, our VPs have certainly felt a heightened sense of urgency and accountability because now they're actually routinely evaluating their own contracts in their one-on-ones with their leaders. Last thing I would say on this is we are continuously demonstrating the value of the work that's happening, and we have to. So the leaders who are participating in these weekly meetings, while they may not always be fun, they are able to see the value derived, not just from a financial or a clinical quality perspective, but they're starting to see this is enhancing alignment on the overall strategic growth of our organization.
Well, Melissa, thanks so much for your thoughts and kind of setting us up with this idea of putting together a governance structure. Stephanie, I'd love to turn to you now and get your opinion on where an organization should start when they're either establishing a new governance process or revisiting their current one to tweak it to what their needs are.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think Melissa hit on something when she started talking about in securing your executive buy-in. In my opinion, the first thing that you do when you start entering into a governance process, whether you're building a new one or you're refining it, and you really need to focus on this, is securing the executive sponsorship and then leadership sponsorship. And then why? Why are you doing this? Really communicate why you're entering into this governance process. Stakeholders really need to understand the specific business problem that you're trying to solve. And What type of strategic objectives are you trying to achieve? Are you trying to mitigate risk, ensure compliance, improve your decision making, or efficiency? And maybe it's all of those things, but alignment and clearly defining the why is really going to become your guidance throughout this process, so that when you experience those challenges, you're going to be able to come back to that and have those discussions and keep that governance project on course. And then it's imperative that you have that executive leadership and that leadership buy-in, so that you've got that commitment to ensure that when you face challenges as you go through this governance process, which you inevitably will, and we're going to talk about some of the challenges and some of the ways to overcome those, you're prepared for those risks, but you've also got leadership and executive support that's saying, this is a process we're going to enter into. It's the way that we're going to do business as an organization. This is why, and these are the benefits that you're going to see as a result of that.
Thanks. You mentioned challenges. So Stephanie, what challenges have you seen other organizations face when they've gone through this process of setting up the contract governance structure?
Now, I'm excited to, you hate to talk about challenges, but it's nice to talk about them because we're all going to face them. And I know through the conversations that Ritu, you and Melissa and I have had preparing for this discussion, like, she's faced some as well, and we're going to have the talk about. I'm excited to hear what Melissa has to say about this. But I would say, first, lack of clear vision, buy-in, and leadership support, which is why that first step must absolutely be to define your why and secure that executive sponsorship and that leadership across the organization. Inconsistent leadership or inconsistent support from your leadership, especially around your governance initiatives, when there's so many other things going on within your organization, can really take that governance initiative and they start to falter because there's a lack of perceived importance to that process that you're instilling. Oftentimes, we want to know about the why. If you don't have the why, there's often unclear objectives. There's misalignment in why you're doing it. It's maybe not strategically linked to your business process, and the value may not be well articulated. So it's really important to make sure that you're having those conversations and you're educating, which Melissa talked about. A lot of education they've been doing as a part of this process. Without that, it's really difficult to gain widespread support, prioritize those efforts. So it's important to outline the governance process, define the why, define the scope, making sure it's not too narrow or too broad, and that everybody understands why you're doing it, so that you're eliminating confusion. There can often be a lack of awareness and understanding. So we talked about that why that education is so important. I'll add, I'm going through several, but change is hard. There's oftentimes organizational and cultural resistance to new processes or policies. Sometimes people look at those as being overly restrictive or burdensome, and sometimes it's just change is difficult and it's a departure from your familiar way of working. So that over communication is key, and we're going to talk a little bit about how you can ensure that you're identifying some wins along the way and the value that it's providing to individuals and their own business units. And I think that change is really oftentimes difficult because there is that kind of fear of transparency or lack of control when maybe organizations have had these decentralized contracting processes. Maybe they've been operating departmentally in silos. And so now bringing that together is really shining light on what those processes are. And while ultimately it's to improve the organization, sometimes there's that concern of, okay, well, now you're going to be really digging into and kind of micromanaging what I'm doing from a day-to-day, when it's actually the governance process is really being established to do the opposite. The positive of that is that governance structure is going to bring together departments that maybe have previously worked in departmental silos. So, Melissa talked about, they've really quickly identified that finance was a key team member that maybe they didn't initially think about and putting into the process. So you start to break down those barriers throughout your organization and start bringing those teams together. And then the other thing that I'll say that can oftentimes be a challenge is resource constraints. And your team members have other jobs. They have day-to-day responsibilities and regular, tasks that they have to make sure that they're completing. So oftentimes when you're identifying those right people, you need to develop like a charter, what their responsibilities are, and make sure you've got their active engagement. Just so that when you're implementing this governance framework, it doesn't fall to the side, because it does require resources, both personnel. It's going to require oftentimes financial resources as well, which is sometimes something that people and organizations don't think about when they're implementing a governance process. It's more than just policies and procedures. You're going to need to put some technology behind it. We're going to talk a little bit about that. And when you're doing that, your executive leaders, right? They want to talk about, well, what's the return on investment? And we'll talk about how to demonstrate some of that, because it can be sometimes a challenge to identify that quantifiable return on investment.
Stephanie, thanks for sharing some of the challenges you've seen with the clients you've worked with. Melissa, I'm curious to know if any of the things that Stephanie has mentioned resonate with you, and if you could share some of the key challenges you guys faced as you were putting this process in place.
Absolutely. Ritu, before I dive into the challenges
You
we've seen,
got
we got a
couple
question
questions?
we got a question from
saw-
Amy. So I'm going to address that one first, and then
Sure,
I'll dive into the challenges. So Amy asked the group if whether all of our contracts are going through this governance committee, or do we have certain contracts that are excluded from this review? So amazing question. This is something that has continued to evolve. So as it stands, we currently have about 9 or 10 contract types that are excluded from our contract governance committee review. So things like our business associate agreements, especially those that are on our own paper, NDAs, internal real estate leases, so any like internal realty documents, small contracts that are like event specific, like if we're having a gala and we need to rent a ballroom at a hotel, right? That type of thing. Some signage agreements. So those have been the way that they eventually make it onto the excluded list is when we receive a request of that contract type before it's on this excluded list. We'll still bring it to the committee. And usually it's legal kind of championing, hey, we think this is low-hanging fruit. This is not necessarily worth our time and energy to discuss as a group. Legal will still do their own review of it. Do you all agree that this should be exempt from this process? And then we vote on it that way. So it's evolving, but we haven't added a new contract type to it in a little while, just by virtue of seeing the same types come through. So I hope that's helpful, Amy.
Melissa, before you answer, I would love to know, Stephanie, in your experience when you're dealing with providers, do you see any other types of contracts that are excluded, or do you see like a focus or two different processes with various types of contracts?
Yeah, oftentimes we'll see very similar types excluded that Melissa talked about, right? Especially when you're contracting on your own paper, you've got standard terms and conditions from NDAs and BAAs. Those are things that you really don't necessarily need to have a legal review occur. We will oftentimes see two governance processes, one for your higher risk referral source types of arrangements, and then two, of course, your kind of vendor contracts as well. So I've seen that. It varies across organizations, but I would say those are kind of the main two governance paths we'll see.
Okay, perfect. Sorry, Melissa, I'm going to cut you off again. So we did have a question, Melissa, if you could share your committee charter and agenda. So Wendy, we will have some takeaway slides that will be shared after the end of this session. And what we decided was, instead of actually sharing Melissa's paper, the slides include like the main topics and what was covered in the charter. And then, Melissa, I don't think we included an agenda of the type of topics that you cover during your meetings. So maybe when we get to our portion of the discussion related to kind of the governance documents, maybe you could even share some of the topics that you guys regularly cover during the meetings.
Sure.
Okay, so let's get to the challenges, because I would like to know if Stephanie is just kind of making some of these challenges up. No, I'm just kidding, Stephanie. But no, but really, like real time, Melissa, like some of the challenges that you guys faced as you were going through this process.
Yes, so we've certainly had our fair share. So in the early stages, I would say our biggest challenges were centered around operational or like logistics. So things like initially we were only meeting bi-weekly for 30 minutes, and that was completely unrealistic for the volume of contracts that we were seeing, right? This volume quickly outpaced our capacity to review them. So this backlog was unmanageable. So we increased the frequency and the duration of our meetings, which is a heavy lift when you're talking about a room full of vice presidents or directors, right? And carving out time on their calendars. So we made it a part of our standard calendar for the organization. We also started to see a lot of our contracts are being held up for the same reasons. So they were missing information like whether a finance review had been completed, if there were potential technical risks. And so this prompted us to completely redesign our contract approval form to collect that critical business context up front. So things like, is PHI going to be involved? Do we have executive sponsorship in place? Are there any financial implications that should require further scrutiny? And then we also clarified our appeal process. So if a contract was not going to be recommended by the committee, what does that path forward look like? Who has the final authority to make that decision? So we were including those things into our governance charter as we were working through these operational challenges. And then I would say beyond the just operational or process improvements, the more nuanced challenge was alignment, right? So getting everyone on the same page about what is the role, what is the purpose of this governance body. The number of times, Ritu, I've had to remind our stakeholders that we are not there to wordsmith every single clause, right? Legal is going to do a legal review. This committee is there to evaluate, is this even the right deal for our organization? So knowing when to elevate something to the full group discussion versus, guys, we got to take this offline, like we're derailing really fast. And then just like with any cross-functional effort, interpersonal dynamics have certainly come into play. So we had to be mindful that different departments are going to be more risk adverse or cautious. Some departments prioritize a different pillar of our organization, and we have to appreciate that. So creating space for those productive conversations and not letting them bottleneck. And then lastly, I would say just working to build awareness across the organization's leadership about the full scope of the process, right? Trying to emphasize this is not just a rubber stamp. We're not adding red tape to the process. This needs to be a meaningful review. And that really helped us set expectations for our leaders around what is a reasonable timeline, what is a reasonable outcome of this process.
Something that I thought, Melissa, was really interesting in our conversations is as you were rolling this out, like how you make sure that you're sustaining momentum and ensuring the effectiveness of the process, because it can often be challenging to do that. Because governance really isn't that one-time project, and you've got to continually monitor and audit it, refine it, like you've talked about. How did you address that?
I mean, like I said, we have changed this form countless times. We've changed our charter so many times. I don't think we've gone more than a couple of weeks without making at least one small pivot. So I think you just have to be adaptable, flexible, and willing to pivot your priorities as the system priorities change, right? So just maintaining that level of flexibility is really key here.
Right. I think, you've obviously, with the Integris team, designed this fantastic governance process, and, now everybody's on board. I like to now think about this governance process moving into what we call the long haul, right? And we need to ask ourselves this question about, after we've gotten everybody really excited about this new process and we've educated our teams and we've talked about why it's so important and the impact it's going to have on the organization, is it so often a challenge to kind of sustain that momentum and ensure that it actually stays effective over time? And I have, thoughts around this that I'd like to share. And of course, Ritu and Melissa would love your thoughts on it. But I mean, I think, your initial enthusiasm is going to dip. Project's going to pop up. Suddenly, those day-to-day commands of the business are going to kind of overshadow those governance routines that we're really trying to make sure that we're instilling within the organization. And I think another reason that we've seen is that, good governance isn't always a flashing neon sign, right? Risk mitigation and smoother decision-making processes, efficiencies, while they're incredibly valuable, they're subtle. And so it's difficult to always be shouting the wins that organizations are seeing. You've got to find opportunities to do that. Since it isn't a set it and forget it, and you have to continue to tweak it like you talked about, and it can feel like a continuous effort to do that. How have you addressed within your organization, making sure that you don't have governance fatigue?
Oh, yes, we've certainly experienced that. I keep proposing that we include margaritas at this committee meeting, but no one's gone for that yet. So no, I would say, just like we talked about, where people are excited at the beginning. So like I said, this was a top-down direction. And so at the beginning, the first year that I was involved in this committee was really getting set off, this was a measurable KPI that our highest level of leadership was tracking. And so everyone was really excited about it. This is a metric, this is like a strategic initiative. Well, now it's morphed into like, this is our daily standard work. This is just a part of your daily practice. And so naturally the enthusiasm does dip. So I think for us, we've had to lean more rather than relying on this natural enthusiasm of something that's new and exciting. Now we're more focused on like, how can we measure our success and demonstrate that value to the leaders to keep them engaged?
And there are some things that, I've worked with organizations that we've done that again, be really interested in your thoughts and Ritu's thoughts, but kind of how we overcome that governance fatigue. And one of the things that we really focus on is embedding it into your governance process, not having it as a bolt-on. You've got to weave those tasks directly into your existing workflows, into their regular responsibilities, so it doesn't really feel like an extra step, but it's more of a culture of governance, a culture of compliance, and becomes just a way that organizations are doing things. Secondly, and you've talked about this, you've got to continually demonstrate that value and track those KPIs and communicate those successes, which, I think you're showing how governance is helping you achieve those business goals, like going back to the why of why you set out to do this in the first place, and identifying and sidestepping some of those potential problems so that those benefits really start to feel tangible, and different departments and different areas of the organization are seeing them. And you've talked about kind of that constant evolution. You've reworked your form many times. You've adjusted your, charter of people who have come into the process. And I would completely agree with that. It's got to be a living, kind of breathing process that's constantly iterated on. You have to set your commitment, set your steering committee, regularly review how that's working, seek that feedback actively, and not just from the stakeholders and the people that are involved in your process, but from those that are coming to and participating in your committee, and constantly evolve that. And then of course, keeping your leaders engaged. I know we're going to talk about CLM, but one thing that I really like to also think about when we're talking about these governance processes is automating what you can, so that it doesn't feel like it's more resource burdensome on your team members as you're starting to, move towards this culture of governance. And that's going to, one, make things more consistent, but two, it's going to give people time where you've added a new process. It's not going to feel like an additional burden. And in my experience, kind of looking at and focusing on these areas really helps us move a governance process from one that just exists within the organization to one that's really optimized and drives within the organization and delivers value and lasting value.
I think that is totally spot on, Stephanie. I promise I did not plant this question that just came in, but I'm going to make a comment, which is the comment I was going to make, but I think it's great with this question that's come in. But it's ownership. It's making sure your stakeholders actually have ownership in the contracting process, and having them do some of the legwork, right? It's not all legal's responsibilities. This goes right to this question that we just got in that says, any tips, and this for, Stephanie or Melissa, any tips for ensuring the cross-functional responsibilities, finance, ops, clinical, et cetera, and to make sure that those responsibilities remain with the right folks. This individual said, sometimes I feel the clinical leaders pushing their due diligence responsibilities onto legal, right? And then things get bottlenecked at legal. Can you engage this vendor, like questions that come in, right? Or can you engage this vendor and ask about pricing and products? Can you set up a call with this vendor and talk to them about the renewal? Things that we would say from a legal perspective, right, are not legal questions, but operational questions. And, I think most legal departments, even outside counsel, right, respond and say, happy to help. But, we can't unilaterally make decisions about the business, right? And that business owner engagement is really needed, especially related to clinical needs and operationalizing. So, Stephanie and Melissa, any thoughts on that?
I would say for us, we push it back on the leaders by engaging them in our process, right? So we will have, if someone at one of our, like at our flagship hospital, they really want a new MRI or something like that, right? They're not pushing it back on supply chain or legal. We're saying, okay, come to this committee meeting and let us ask you questions, and we put it back on them. So part of this, I think, also just comes down to the way in which our legal team functions with our leaders. So I'm not engaging with the vendor directly, right? I'm engaging with our business leader and saying, hey, reach out to your point of contact and let's get comfort on these 4 points. So I'm kind of putting it back on them to really be that point of contact with the vendor.
Yeah, I think that your governance process, right? You're educating on like what is the responsibility of legal and what's the responsibility of your business owners. But then when you start thinking about how you incorporate technology into it, your technology can also support that process, right? Because it wouldn't be able to come to legal unless certain due diligence was completed. So when you kind of think about how you're wrapping that policy into and that procedure and the governance process that you've laid out, can you incorporate that into your technology so that your business owners know what their responsibilities are? And there's that delineation between when legal is going to get involved and when they're not going to get involved, or when some stakeholders may need to.
We've got some really good questions that have come in. So before I get to governance documents, we have a question on, this is probably for you, Melissa. What's the volume of contracts that are reviewed by the committee at that committee level? Like, so, and then what's the average time frame for completion of a contract that goes through the process?
Mm-hmm. So the volume definitely varies, right? Just even like we see many more contracts in, July than December. So it varies, right? Just by virtue of the calendar. I would say on average, we're covering anywhere from, as far as new contracts before the committee that have not been previously held, I would say we're covering anywhere from like 15 to 20 generally, I would say on average per week. That's not to say that sometimes there's less or more. And then every week we just hit the high points on any contracts that are previously held that we need more information on. So we always assign like who has that action item. Is it someone from legal is confirming with a business leader on a certain question that the committee had? Are we inviting that business leader to come attend the next meeting to address questions in person? So we have like a bucket that are previously held either due to time because we didn't get to it the last meeting or because we had additional clarification. And then we have a bucket for new contracts, new amendments, and new statements of work.
Got it. So we have another question that's come in. I know Melissa Integris is in the process of evaluating and engaging a CLM partner. But the question that we have is, what are the examples of how you're automating? So can you talk about any automation that you have before actually getting into that CLM, since I know you don't have a CLM yet?
Yeah. So after the committee meeting, the project manager who's in charge of this, he sends out an email to the entire committee and then also anyone who submitted a contract for review for that week. And in that, they attach the meeting minutes, and it usually just says recommend proceed, do not recommend proceed, held for additional questions, right? And then that project manager is going to individually email the business leader who submitted the contract request and the lawyer assigned for that matter with the questions or follow-up matters. So as much as I wouldn't say it's automated in the sense that like this is a time-intensive, labor-intensive process, right? And our goal is not that this is going to sustain in perpetuity at this degree, right? Our goal is that this will morph into CLM. We're just getting the process in place. What is that going to eventually look like in a technology workflow? How do we adjust that process, if that makes sense?
So Stephanie, I'm going to turn to you now, because what I imagine is what Melissa is talking about are things that can be automated in a CLM. So I know we were going to talk about technology in a few minutes, but if you don't mind, maybe giving a little bit of a reaction to some of the things that Melissa has said and how that can be automated, or can it be?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that, first of all, you absolutely aren't going to be able to continue to scale without having some sort of technology to support this. And, and whether you're bringing CLM into an existing governance process, right, or a brand new one that you're starting, you need to think about that technology that you're going to want to include. But your technology should wrap around and support your governance process. So you're automating things like your workflows, you're automating things like your intake forms, you're automating, who's getting those contracts as they're going through the process. So do you need to, based on different terms and conditions, incorporate, legal or risk, or do you need to incorporate someone from a financial review to complete a financial review? All of those types of workflows can be automated within the CLM. But beyond just automating and creating efficiency, what it does is it gives line of sight into what's working well within your process, what's not working so well within your process, right? Like you can start to use data to kind of make some business decisions around where could there be some need for adjustment in our governance process, but beyond that, where might there be need in to look at how we're contracting, how our business owners are going out and engaging with their vendors and the conversations that you're having. There are likely things within your organizations that, standard terms and conditions that are acceptable to your organization and those that aren't. And you want to make sure that those are visible and that technology can kind of help support that. So your business owners are starting to be educated on what they can and cannot do. It takes some of that burden off of legal so you can focus on some of those tasks that are outside of negotiating contracts. And then use your data not only in your workflows and like automating that process, but like use your data to, look at how you can make some different strategic business decisions.
Thanks, Stephanie. Melissa, we have one more question. All the things that you've talked about sound super easy. I'm just saying, we're talking about one hospital, right? But for those that are familiar with Integris, which goes to this question, when you're a system of various hospitals, how did Integris kind of manage that? So did you have various contracting processes across all of your hospitals when you started this journey, or had you guys already brought everything under one roof? And then the question goes on to say, how did Integris address identifying all the points of contact and initiation with all your various offices to then centralize that contracting process?
Yeah, so fortunately, it was already at a system level, like our
Okay.
contracting process by the time I joined the team. So thankfully, I did not have to handle that. But there are a lot of points of contact. So it is clunky. I'm not claiming that this process is without its flaws, right? So essentially, right, when a business leader identifies a need for maybe a new piece of equipment or new floor mats, whatever it may be, right? Are they engaging with supply chain? Are they engaging? They're getting quotes and contracts from vendors. Then they engage with legal services. And that's what kind of kicks off our whole process that I can chat more about in just a moment. But basically, they're filling out a detailed form. It comes to legal. We're identifying, yes, this goes to contract governance versus no, this is exempt. From there, within a week, typically, it's reviewed by contract governance. I think someone asked this earlier and I forgot to touch on it. On average, our metrics show that a contract sits with contract governance. I think it's like an average of like 4.3 business days. So it's slightly less than 1 week, I would say. Once contract governance approves it, then the legal or the lawyer assigned is going to kick off their review and engage with that business leader submitting the request on these are the proposed red lines. Please send them to your counterpart, negotiating it, and then we take it back on the execution piece and sending it out for signatures.
All right, so we have one more question that's just come in. You guys, thank you so much for sending your questions in. This is incredible. Do you work with finance closely? And if so, how are you dividing responsibility of negotiating commercial terms like price, volume, based discounts, multi-year discounts, utilization, et cetera? And then how are you interacting with department budgets? Or is that even something that's on the forefront, right, of this governance committee? And then the question further goes on to just talk about, we've got some situations where the CFO wants to be heavily involved in the discussions. But then, on the flip side, the CFO then doesn't want to be in the weeds of the contract and the procurement process. So any insight on that, Melissa?
Ooh, I have a lot. I want to be mindful of our time. So I'll try to hit the high points, but y'all can always contact me afterwards. So like I said, one of our biggest lessons learned was how much finance needed to have insight into this whole process. So we have engaged just about our entire finance team. And so the way for our system it works, our CFO definitely has awareness of this process and has supported it. He is not in the weeds as far as he is not personally attending these contract governance committee meetings. But our vice president of accounting, who reports directly to our CFO, she absolutely is in the weeds with this. So she is looking at those payment terms, looking at the actual price. Is this reasonable? She is a details person, so that certainly helps. And she drives so much of the actual valuable conversation that's occurring at these meetings. We do have on our request for contract approval form, we have a whole finance section. So we're asking the business leader before the committee even looks at it, identifies this a revenue or expense? What is the total cost or expense over the term of the contract, right? Is this within your department's budget? So they have to say yes or no. If no, explain why. And that is a huge, huge point of discussion every single week. Is it budget neutral, right? Is it an increase or a decrease if this is an existing vendor? What are your negotiated savings? So we're actually capturing all those key finance components on this form that is then sent with the contract to the committee for review 2 business days before their meeting. That way they at least have time to kind of skim over it and see, do I have any questions or concerns that I'm going to bring up when we get to this contract at our meeting?
I love that, Melissa. I mean, as a compliance attorney, and working with clients that are under CIAs, definitely constantly thinking about compliance with the fraud and abuse laws. So knowing that you're getting all that information on this, contract approval form in terms of the business justification for the contract, and also having a record of what are the terms reasonable? Are they commercially reasonable? Are they consistent with other contracts you have? I think is great. Before we get to the charter and the governance documents, we have one more question that's come in, which I think is a really good one for any one of you, and I'm happy to share my thoughts as well. This question or comment that's come in with the question is: we currently use supply chain as the quarterback of contracting, but it seems more and more that they are pushing back on legal and business owners. How much is supply chain involved in your contracting process? So Lisa, I'm going to respond with just an anecdote of what I experienced. So years ago, I was working with NTRAX, and we were working with I think a prospective client for NTRAX, but I was brought in from a compliance perspective. And it was new for me because as a compliance attorney, I'm usually actually working with compliance and legal on contract issues and compliance with various regs. So when we went to this group, this new client, and we're talking to supply chain, it was very new to me that supply chain would be the owner of all these contracts, because most of the contracts that we were really worried about were those where there was a referral source on the other end. Now, after going through that process with them, they had an amazing playbook. Their contracts not only covered the vendor type contracts that were in supply chain, but they also had a nice workflow process on the compliance side. And hence, my value add to that discussion was all of the things that they needed to be thinking about from a compliance perspective, like Stark and kickback and other things. So I don't think it really matters if supply chain is quarterbacking or not. I think what you want to make sure is that whoever that department is, whether you decide for it to be supply chain, that they understand the compliance and regulatory risks that you have and are willing to champion that. So that's my perspective. Stephanie, Melissa, any other thoughts to add to that?
Yeah, I'll add that it's very, very oftentimes that we see supply chain very involved in the contracting process. Less so when we're talking about your physician, right? They're not managing and oftentimes negotiating your physician contracts and your APP agreements, anything that is more clinical facing. But what Ritu spoke about around making sure that you're infusing that governance process, but also that culture of compliance, is really, really important. And I think from my perspective, supply chain teams are doing a really good job of starting to learn and understand more around the regulatory landscape and things that can have an impact on, Sarbanes kickback and other regulatory issues. So as long as you've got that really strong playbook and you're infusing that into your supply chain process, I think it's okay. We're not seeing supply chain oftentimes involved in position type arrangements, but IT agreements and other types of services that are being provided throughout an organization, it's pretty common.
Well, and I think, before, when we really had compliance kind of driving the maintenance of the CLM and maybe legal involved to make sure things are pushed through, in discussions with the OIG, when we're dealing with clients that are under CIAs, OIG really pushes that compliance should not be part of operations. Contracting is a very operational function. And so if you have compliance champions in supply chain and they're willing to go to compliance or legal to get the information that's needed, I think supply chain is a great place for the contract management to lie, as long as you make sure that things aren't falling through the cracks. So, I mean, I've definitely changed full circle from when I went all the way out to Kansas for this one client. But it seems like if you have a good partnership with supply chain, a great place to have that go through. Again, I think it's a little bit tricky when sometimes in some organizations, supply chain's not seeing the contracts with physicians and referral sources. So I think you just need to make sure you bridge that gap. We have another comment, and I think I'm going to speak for Melissa and Stephanie. We'll just say yes, but Lisa asked if she could see some of the questions that you have on your intake form, and I think we've got various examples. So Lisa, if you email one of us, we can certainly send you the types of questions, because I know the questions that we've put together for physician contracting, those questions may be a little bit different than some of the vendor contracts, but generally are aligned. So with that, we only have 3 minutes left. Melissa, I really do want to get just some high level thoughts about your charter, because I think that would be really helpful. And then of course, we'll send the slides that have our high level bullet points in them.
Sure, I'll be quick. So our charter is just the backbone of our governance structure, right? So it outlines the composition of the committee, like we talked about earlier. It talks about really the core purpose of this committee is that they're there to oversee and guide our contracting process. And so emphasizing goals like driving cost savings, reducing spend, enhancing the financial health. But beyond just finance considerations, the committee is there to evaluate risk, ensure compliance, identify unfavorable terms, push for better negotiated outcomes. So it outlines our voting process, including how we recommend approval, recommend against proceeding, or if we need to hold a contract for additional information. It also provides a process if we can't reach consensus. It provides a clear escalation path. So a lot of times this is because the contract didn't have a clear ROI, they didn't involve finance in the right way, it's not tied to a capital project. And then similarly, we built in an appeal process. So that way, if a stakeholder disagrees with the denial, they know how to request a second review. It identifies our exempt contract types like we were talking about earlier. And this just helps to create clarity and just a shared understanding across the group. And then real quick on the questions on our intake form, obviously it hits the high points like who is the vendor, what is the contract type, that the basics you would expect. Beyond that is it really does require a lot of business and operational insight. So executive sponsorship, we actually ask our business leaders to submit an email. It can be one sentence from their vice president saying they know about the contract, they're supportive of it, they agree with the impact to budget and the ROI, and they recommend it moving forward. We have a whole technical risk evaluation section for IT security issues. We talked about the financial components. One recent change is that we actually require a formal financial review for any contract that exceeds $50,000 or that is not budgeted. So even if it's less than $50,000, if it's not budgeted, then you need to get a financial review. And we identify which financial leaders they should be contacting for that discussion. And then lastly, huge point, but privacy and compliance. So we're asking, does it involve PHI? Is there offshoring? Are there any known conflicts of interest? And then they actually attest that everything is true and accurate to their knowledge, which just helps us immensely from a compliance standpoint. So we just really want to strike that balance. How can we get enough information for effective governance without being so burdensome that no leader is going to want to fill out a 20-page form, right? So we're trying to see, can we make this manageable while still maintaining the right level of accountability?
And I'll just add that last point, Melissa, that you made is incredibly important. Like, don't make it overcomplicated. No one, especially when you're doing a new governance process, you want to make sure that you're making it you're going to scale it, but you want to make sure that your team members are going to be able to align to that process and not feel like it's overly burdensome.
Well, you guys, we are at time, and I am very mindful and respectful of people's time. And thank you so much, you guys, for being an amazing, active audience. Angela, it sounds like we need a part 2 because there's definitely other things to talk about. But Stephanie and Melissa, thank you for sharing. Melissa, especially you, thank you so much for being so open and sharing your process. I mean, working with a number of clients who end up getting a CIA and now have this requirement of managing their contracts with referral sources, the idea of putting together this governance process and kind of knowing where things are is so daunting. So to hear that you guys did it without even being under a CIA and you've done it, you to be doing it well, and then also to being very candid of saying you're constantly perfecting this and paying attention to it. I think that is really important. So you guys, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for being an amazing audience. We will make sure that the slides are sent out. Our contact information is available. Feel free to reach out to any one of us. Have a wonderful day. Take care.
Thank you, Ritu, Stephanie, and Melissa for presenting an excellent presentation. Looks like we'll be working with you on a part 2 for this one. Thank you, audience, for joining us today for this important discussion brought to you by NTRAX. NTRAX is the leading contract lifecycle management solution built specifically for healthcare organizations, and you can learn more at www.ntrax.com. This concludes today's program. The live webinar will be disconnected now. Thank you.
Thank you all.